You can watch all my previous chapters on YouTube if you want to. I have some nice cappuccino, hot and frothy, just as I like it. Right, so last week, chapter 42, The Whiteness of the Whale. We're reading about all the different ways that whiteness can be perceived as very negative and dangerous and portentous of doom. So, chapter 43, Hark, it says. Hark. Now. Hist, did you hear that noise, Cabaco? It was the middle watch, a fair moonlight. The seamen were standing in a cordon extending from one of the freshwater butts in the waist to the scuttlebutt, near the taffrail. In this manner they passed the buckets to fill the scuttlebutt. Standing, for the most part, on the hallowed precincts of the quarter-deck, they were careful not to speak or rustle their feet. From hand to hand the buckets went in the deepest silence, only broken by the occasional flap of a sail and the steady hum of the unceasingly advancing keel. It was in the midst of this repose that Archie, one of the cordon, whose post was near the after hatches, whispered to his neighbour, a cholo, the words above. I hissed, did you hear that noise? Oh, I didn't realise that chapter 43 was only that long. Did you hear that noise, Cabaco? Take the bucket, will you, Archie? What noise do you mean? There it is again, under the hatches. Don't you hear it? A cough. It sounded like a cough. Cough be damned. Pass along that return bucket. There again, there it is. It sounds like 2 or 3 sleepers turning over now. Caramba! Have done, shipmate, will ye? It's the 3 soaked biscuits you eat for supper turning over inside of you, nothing else. Look to the bucket. Caramba, I like that, caramba. Say what ye will, shipmate, I've sharp ears. Aye, you are the chap, ain't ye, that heard the hum of the old Quakeress's knitting needles 15 miles at sea from Nantucket? You're the chap. Hello, Dav Travels and Senator. Grin away, we'll see what turns up. Harkee, Cabaco, there is somebody down there in the afterhold that has not yet been seen on deck. I suspect our old mogul knows something of it too. I heard Stubb tell Flask one morning watch that there was something of that sort in the wind. Tish, that bucket. Very short chapter, right. Chapter 44. Oh, well. Okay, chapter 44 is a little bit longer. Chapter 44, The Chart. Had you followed Captain Ahab down into his cabin after the squall that took place on the night succeeding that wild ratification of his purpose with his crew, you would have seen him go to a locker in the transom and bring out a large wrinkled roll of yellowish sea charts, spread them before him on the screwed-down table. Then, seating himself before it, you would have seen him intently study the various lines and shadings which there met his eye, and with slow but steady pencil trace additional courses over spaces that before were blank. We can't finish. We'll get through this. We're about that far through. At intervals, he would refer to piles of old logbooks beside him, wherein were set down the seasons and places in which, on various former voyages of various ships, sperm whales had been captured or seen. While thus employed, the heavy pewter lamp suspended in chains over his head continually rocked with the motion of the ship, and forever threw shifting gleams and shadows of lines upon his wrinkled brow, till it almost seemed that, while he himself was marking out lines and courses on the wrinkled chart, some invisible pencil was also tracing lines and courses upon the deeply marked chart of his forehead. But it was not this night in particular that, in the solitude of his cabin, Ahab thus pondered over his charts. Almost every night they were brought out. Almost every night some pencil marks were effaced and others were substituted. For with the charts of all 4 oceans before him, 4? Atlantic, Pacific, Arctic and Indian, I guess. Before him, Ahab was threading a maze of currents and eddies with a view to the more certain accomplishment of that monomaniac thought of his whole soul. Now, to anyone not fully acquainted with the ways of the Leviathans, it might seem an absurdly hopeless task thus to seek out one solitary creature in the unhooped oceans of this planet. But not so did it seem to Ahab, who knew the sets of all tides and currents, and thereby calculating the driftings of the sperm whale's food, and also calling to mind the regular ascertained seasons for hunting him in particular latitudes, could arrive at reasonable surmises, almost approaching to certainties, concerning the timeless day to be upon this or that ground in search of his prey. So assured, indeed, is the fact concerning the periodicalness of the sperm whale's resorting to given waters, that many hunters believe that, could he be closely observed and studied throughout the world, with the logs for one voyage of the entire whale fleet carefully collated, then the migrations of the sperm whale would be found to correspond in invariability to those of the heron shoals or the flights of swallows. On this hint, attempts have been made to construct elaborate migratory charts of the sperm whale. Besides, when making a passage from one feeding ground to another, the sperm whales, guided by some infallible instinct, say rather secret intelligence from the deity, mostly swim in veins, as they are called, continuing their way along a given ocean line with such undeviating exactitude that no ship ever sailed her course by any chart with one tithe of such marvellous precision. Though in these cases, the direction taken by any one whale be straight as a surveyor's parallel, and though the line of advance be strictly confined to its own unavoidable straight wake, yet the arbitrary vein in which these times he is said to swim generally embraces some few miles in width, more or less as the vein is presumed to expand or contract, but never exceeds the visual sweep from the whale ship's masthead when circumspectly gliding along this magic zone. The sum is that at particular seasons within the breadth and along the path, migrating whales may be with great confidence be looked for. And hence, not only at substituted times upon well-known separate feeding grounds could Ahab hope to encounter his prey, but in crossing the widest expanse of water between those grounds he could, by his art, so place and time himself on his way as even then not to be wholly without prospect of a meeting. There was a circumstance. Oh, hang on. I'll have a little sip before I get started on this mega paragraph. There was a circumstance which at first sight seemed to entangle his delirious but still methodical scheme, but not so in the reality, perhaps. Though the gregarious sperm whales have their regular seasons for particular grounds, yet in general you cannot conclude that the herds which hunted such and such a latitude or longitude this year, say, will turn out to be identically the same with those that were found there the preceding season, though there are peculiar and unquestionable instances where the contrary of this has proved true. In general, the same remark, only within a less wide limit, applies to the solitaries and hermits among the matured, aged sperm whales. So that though Moby Dick had in a former year been seen, for example, on what is called the Seychelles ground in the Indian Ocean, or Volcano Bay on the Japanese coast, yet it did not follow that were the Pequot to visit either of those spots at any subsequent corresponding season, she would infallibly encounter him there. So too with some other feeding grounds where he had at times revealed himself. But all these seemed only his casual stopping places and ocean inns, so to speak, not his places of prolonged abode. And where Ahab's chances of accomplishing his object have hitherto been spoken of, allusion has only been made to whatever wayside, antecedent, extra prospects were his, ere a particular set time or place were attained, when all possibilities would become probabilities, and as Ahab fondly thought every possibility the next thing to a certainty. That particular set time and place were conjoined in one technical phrase, the season on the line. For there and then, for several consecutive years, Moby Dick had been periodically descried lingering in those waters for a while as the sun in its annual round loiters for a predicted interval in any one of the sign of the zodiac. There it was, too, that most of the deadly encounters with the white whale had taken place. There the waves were storied with his deeds. There also was that tragic spot when the monomaniac old man had found the awful motive to his vengeance, with which Ahab threw his brooding soul into this unfaltering hunt. He would not permit himself to rest all his hopes upon the one crowning fact above mentioned, however flattering it might be to those hopes, nor in the sleeplessness of his vow could he be so tranquillize his unquiet heart as to postpone all intervening quest. Now, the Pequot had sailed from Nantucket at the very beginning of the season on the line. No possible endeavour could then enable her commander to make the great passage southwards, called a double Cape Horn, and then turning down 60 degrees of latitude, arrive in the equatorial Pacific in time to cruise there. Therefore, he must wait for the next ensuing season. Yet the premature hour of the Pequod's sailing had perhaps been correctly selected by Ahab, with a view to this very complexion of things, because an interval of 365 days and nights was before him, an interval which, instead of impatiently enduring ashore, he would spend in a miscellaneous hunt, if by chance the white whale, spending his vacation in seas far remote from this periodical feeding ground, should turn up his wrinkled brow off the Persian Gulf, or the Bengal Bay, or China Seas, or in any other waters haunted by his race. So that monsoons, pampas, nor'westers, harmattans, trades, any wind but the levanter and saloon might blow Moby Dick into the devious zigzag whirl circle of the Pequod's circumnavigating wake. But granting all this, regarding discreetly and coolly, seems it not but a mad idea, this, that in the broad boundless ocean one solitary whale, even if encountered, should be thought capable of individual recognition from his hunter, even as a white-bearded mufti in the thronged thoroughfares of Constantinople. Yes, for the particular snow-white brow of Moby Dick and his snow-white hump could not be unmistakable. And have I not tallied the whale, Ahab would mutter to himself, as after poring over his charts long after till midnight, he would throw himself back in his reveries, tallied him, and shall he escape? His broad fins are bored and scalloped out like a lost sheep's ear. And here his mad mind would run on in a breathless race till a weariness and faintness of pondering came over him, and in the open air of the deck he would seek to recover his strength. Ah, God, what trances of torments does that man endure who is consumed with one unachieved revengeful desire! He sleeps with clenched hands and wakes with his own bloody nails in his palms. Often, when forced from his hammock by exhausting and intolerably vivid dreams of the night which resumed his own intense thoughts throughout the day, carried them on amid clashing frenzies and whirling them round and round in his blazing brain till the very throbbing of his life-spot became insufferable anguish. And when, as was sometimes the case, these spiritual throes in him heaved his being up from its base, and a chasm seemed opening him from which forked flames and lightnings shot up, and accursed fiends beckoned him to leap down among them. When this hell in himself yawned beneath him, a wild cry would be heard throughout the ship, and with glaring eyes Ahab would burst from his stateroom as though escaping from a bed that was on fire. Yet there, perhaps, instead of being the unsuppressible symptoms of some latent weakness, or fright at his own resolve, were but the plainest tokens for its intensity. For at such times, crazy Ahab, the scheming, unappeasedly steadfast hunter of the white whale, this Ahab that had gone to his hammock, was not the agent so caused him to burst from it in horror again. The latter was the eternal, living principle or soul in him, and in sleep, being for the time disassociated from the categorizing mind, which at other times employed for its outer vehicle or agent, it spontaneously sought escape from the scorching contiguity of the frantic thing, of which for the time it was no longer as integral. But as the mind does not exist unless leagued with the soul, therefore it must be that in Ahab's case, yielding up all his thoughts and fancies to his one supreme purpose, that purpose by its own sheer inevitacy of will, forced itself against gods and devils into a kind of self-assumed, independent being of its own. Nay, could grimly live and burn while the common vitality to which it was conjoined fled horror-stricken from the unbidden and unfathered birth. Therefore the tormented spirit that glared out of bodily eyes, that when what seemed Ahab rushed from his room was for this time but a vacated thing, a formless, somnambulistic being, a ray of living light to be sure, but without any object to colour, and therefore a blankness in itself. God help thee, old man, thy thoughts have created a creature in thee, and he whose intense thinking thus makes him a Prometheus, a vulture feeds upon that heart forever, the vulture that very creature he creates. End of chapter. That's an interesting insight into Ahab's mind and, well, even his non-mind, his soul, his own torment. I did like the description. Carried on amid a clashing of frenzies. Oh, Wang Dang, thank you. Clashing of frenzies and whirled them around and round in his blazing brain till the very throbbing of his life spot became insufferable anguish. It is a good book, isn't it? It's really good. Yeah. Let's see, how long's the next chapter? Maybe a little bit too long to read just now. After it's time. Shall we give it a go? Why not? 45. Thank you, Wang Dang, for the award. Alright, chapter 45 then, the affidavit. I've still got enough time and enough coffee. Thank you, Larry. I'll have to pay for my coffee. The affidavit. So far as what there may be of a narrative in this book, thank you, and indeed as indirect touching one or two very interesting and curious particulars in the habits of sperm whales, the foregoing chapter, in its earliest part, is as important as one as will be found in this volume, but the leading matter of it requires to be still further and more familiarly enlarged upon, in order to be adequately understood, and moreover to take away any incredulity which a profound ignorance of the entire subject may induce in some minds, as to the natural verity of the main points of this affair. I care not to perform this part of my task methodically, but shall be content to produce the desired impression by separate citations of items practically or reliably known to me as a whaleman, and from these citations, I take it, the conclusion aimed at will naturally follow of itself. I'm just kind of wondering if that little couple of chapters, a couple of paragraphs there, I'm wondering how much of that is the narrator, Ishmael, or how much of it is Herman Melville. Is he saying, right, I'm going to go back to the beginning of this chapter and make it more clear for those of you who don't quite understand that? How much of that is Ishmael? How much of it is Herman Melville saying that, I wonder? Or is he trying to blend the two together? First, I have personally known these instances, three instances, where a whale, after receiving a harpoon, has effected a complete escape, and after an interval, in one instance of 3 years, has been again struck by the same hand and slain, where the two irons, both marked by the same private cipher, have been taken from the body. In the instance where 3 years intervened between the flinging of the two harpoons, and I think it may have been something more than that, the man who darted after them, happening in the interval to go in a trading ship on a voyage to Africa, went ashore there, joined a discovery party, and penetrated far into the interior, where he travelled for a period of nearly 2 years, often endangered by serpents, savages, tigers, poisonous miasmas, with all the other common perils indecent to wandering in the heart of the unknown regions. Again, I point out that language such as savages is very much of its time, and has to be taken in the context of a book written a couple hundred years ago. Meanwhile, the whale he had struck must also have been on its travels. No doubt it had thrice circumnavigated the globe, brushing with its flanks all the coasts of Africa, but to no purpose. This man and this whale again came together, and the one vanquished the other. I myself have known 3 instances similar to this. That is, in 2 of them I saw the whale struck, and upon the second attack saw the 2 irons with the respective marks cut in them, afterwards taken from the dead fish. In the 3-year instance, it so fell out that I was in the boat both times, first and last, and the last time distinctly recognised a peculiar sort of huge mole under the whale's eye, which I had observed there 3 years previous. I say 3 years, but I am pretty sure that it was more than that. Here are 3 instances, then, when I personally know the truth of, but I have heard of many other instances from persons whose veracity in the matter there is no good ground to impeach. Secondly, it is well known in sperm whale fishery, however ignorant the world ashore may be of it, that there have been several memorable historical instances where a particular whale in the ocean has been at distant times and places popularly recognisable. Why such a whale became thus marked was not altogether and originally owing to his bodily peculiarities as distinguishing from other whales, for however peculiar in that respect any chance whale may be, they soon put an end to his peculiarities by killing him, and boiling him down into a particularly valuable oil. No, the reason was this, that from the fatal experiences of the fishery there hung a terrible prestige of perilousness about such whale as there did about Rinaldo Rinaldini, insomuch that most fishermen were content to recognise him by merely touching their tarpaulins when he would be discovered lounging by them on the sea, without seeking to cultivate a more intimate acquaintance. Like some poor devils ashore that happen to be an irascible great man, they make distant obtrusive salutations to him in the street, lest if they pursued the acquaintance further, they might receive a summary thump for their presumption. I've known a few old men like that. But not only did each of these famous whales enjoy great individual celebrity, nay, you may call it an ocean-wide renown, not only was he famous in life and now is immortal in forecastle stories after death, but he was admitted into all the rights, privileges, and distinctions of a name, had as much a name as Cambyses or Caesar. Was it not so, O Timor Tom rather, thou famed Leviathan, the famed Leviathan scarred like an iceberg, who so long didst lurk at the oriental straits of that name, whose spout was often seen from the palmy beach of Moby. Was it not so, O New Zealand Jack, thou terror of all cruisers that crossed their wakes in the vicinity of the tattoo land? Was it not so, O Morquan, King of Japan, whose lofty jet they say at times assumed the semblance of a snow-white cross against the sky? Was it not so, O Don Miguel, thou Chilean whale marked like an old tortoise with mystic hieroglyphics upon the back? In plain prose, here are 4 whales as well known to the students of cetacean history as Marius or Sulla to the classical scholar. But this is not all. New Zealand Tom and Don Miguel, I said New Zealand Jack a minute ago. Interesting. Yeah, New Zealand Tom and Don Miguel, after various times creating great havoc upon the boats of various vessels, were finally gone in quest of, systematically hunted, chased, and killed by valiant whaling captains, who heaved up their anchors with that great express object as much in view as in setting out through the Narragansett woods. Captain Butler of old had it in his mind to capture that notorious murderous savage Anawan, the headmost warrior of the Indian King Philip. I do not know where I can find a better place than just here to make mention of 1 or 2 other things, which to me seem important, as in printed form establishing all the respects of the reasonableness of the whole story of the white whale, more especially the catastrophe, for that is one of the disheartening instances where truth requires full as much bolstering as error. So ignorant are most landsmen of some of the plainest and most palpable wonders of the world, that without such hints touching the plain facts, historical and otherwise, of the fishery, they might scout at Moby Dick as a monstrous fable, or still worse and more detestable, a hideous and intolerable allegory. Ah, hideous and intolerable. First, though most men have some vague, flitting ideas of the general perils of the grand fishery, yet they have nothing like a fixed, vivid conception of those perils and the frequency with which they recur. One reason, perhaps, is that not 1 in 50 of the actual disasters and deaths by casualties in the fishery ever finds a public record at home, however transient and immediately forgotten that record. Do you suppose that the poor fellow there, who this moment perhaps caught off by the whale line off the coast of New Guinea, is being carried down to the bottom of the sea by the sounding Leviathan, do you suppose that that poor fellow's name will appear in the breakfast obituary, the newspaper obituary you will read tomorrow at your breakfast? No, because the mails are very irregular between here and New Guinea. In fact, did you ever hear what might be called regular news, direct or indirect, from New Guinea? Yet I will tell you that upon one particular voyage which I made to the Pacific, among many others we spoke 30 different ships, every one of which had had a death by a whale, some of them more than one, and 3 that had lost a boat's crew. Each lost a boat's crew. For God's sake, be economical with your lamps and candles. Not a gallon you burn, but at last 1 drop of man's blood was spilled for it. Secondly, people ashore have indeed some indefinite idea that a whale is an enormous creature of enormous power. But I have ever found that when narrating to them some specific example of this twofold enormousness, they have significantly complimented me upon my facetiousness, when I declare upon my soul that I had no more of being facetious than Moses when he wrote the history of the plagues of Egypt. But fortunately, the special point I seek here can be established upon testimony entirely independent of my own. The point is this: the sperm whale is in some cases sufficiently powerful, knowing, and judiciously malicious, as with direct forethought to stave in, utterly destroy, and sink a large ship. By what is more, the sperm whale has done it. First, in the year 1820, the ship Essex, Captain Pollard of Nantucket, was cruising in the Pacific Ocean. One day she saw spouts, lowered her boats, and gave chase to a shoal of sperm whales. Ere long, several of the whales were wounded. Then suddenly a very large whale, escaping from the boats, issued from the shoal and bore directly down upon the ship. Dashing his forehead against the hull, he so stove her in that in less than 10 minutes she settled down and fell over. Nor a surviving plank of her has been seen since. After the severest exposure, part of the crew reached the land on their boats. Being returned home at last, Captain Pollard once more sailed for the Pacific in command of another ship. But the gods shipwrecked him, and upon unknown rocks and breakers, for the second time his ship was utterly lost. And forthwith, forswearing the sea, he has never tempted it since. At this day, Captain Pollard is a resident of Nantucket. I have seen Owen Chase, who was his chief mate of the Essex at the time of the tragedy. I have read his plain and faithful narrative. I have conversed with his son, and all this within a few miles of the scene of the catastrophe. Secondly, the ship Union, also Nantucket, was in the year 1807 totally lost off the Azores by a similar onset, but the authentic particulars of this catastrophe I have never chanced to discover, though from the whale hunters I have now and then heard casual allusions to it. Thirdly, some 18 or 20 years ago, Commodore J, then commanding an American sloop of war, that's J dash, so we can't read it, then commanding an American sloop of war of the first class, happened to be dining with a party of whaling captains on board a Nantucket ship in the harbour of Oahu, Sandwich Islands. Conversation turning upon whales and Commodore, so Sandwich Islands I think is Hawaii. Yeah, Oahu. Conversation turning upon whales, the Commodore was pleased to be sceptical upon touching the amazing strength ascribed to them by the professional gentlemen present. He peremptorily denied, for example, that any whale could so smite his spout sloop of war as he caused her to leak so much as a thimbleful. Very good, but there is more coming. Some weeks after the Commodore set sail in this impregnable craft for Valparaiso, but he was stopped on the way by a portly sperm whale that begged a few moments' confidential business with him. That business consisted in fetching the Commodore's craft such a thwack, that with all his pumps going, he made straight for the nearest port to heave down and repair. I am not superstitious, but I consider the Commodore's interview with that sperm whale as providential. Was not Saul of Tarsus converted from unbelief by a similar fright? I tell you, the sperm whale will stand no nonsense. I'll now refer you to Langsdorff's voyages for a little circumstance in point peculiarly interesting to the writer hereof. Langsdorff, you may know by the way, was attached to the Russian Admiral Krusenstern's famous discovery expedition in the beginning of the present century. Captain Langsdorff thus begins his 17th chapter. By the 13th of May, our ship was ready. This is all in quotation marks. By the 13th of May, our ship was ready to sail, and the next day we were out in the open ocean on our way to something Russian. The weather was very fine and clear, but so intolerably cold that we were obliged to keep on our fur clothing. Maybe Oshkosh. For some days we had very little wind. It was not till the 19th that a brisk gale from the northwest sprang up. An uncommon large whale, the body of which was larger than the ship itself, lay almost at the surface of the water, but was not perceived by anyone on board till the moment when the ship was in full sail, was almost about him, so that it was impossible to prevent it striking against him. We were thus placed in the most imminent danger, and this gigantic creature, setting up its back, raised the ship 3 feet at least out of the water. The masts reeled and the sails fell together, while we who were below all sprang instantly upon the deck, concluding that we had struck upon some rock. Instead of this, we saw the monster sailing off with the utmost gravity and solemnity. Captain de Wolfe applied immediately to the pumps to examine whether or not the vessel had received any damage from the shock, but we found that very happily it had escaped entirely uninjured. End of quote. Now, Captain de Wolfe, here alluded to the commanding the ship in question, is a New Englander who, after a long life of unusual adventures as a sea captain, this day resides in the village of Dorchester, near Boston. I have the honour of being a nephew of his. I have particularly questioned him concerning this passage in Langsdorff. He substantiates every word. The ship, however, was by no means a large one, a Russian craft built on the Siberian coast and purchased by my uncle after bartering away the vessel in which he sailed from home. In that up-and-down manly book of old-fashioned adventure, so full too of honest wonders, the voyage of Lionel Wafer, one of ancient Dampier's old chums. Dampier was a real captain. Henry Dampier, I think. Anyway, I found a little matter set down so that just quoted from Langsdorff that I cannot forbear inserting it here for a corroborative example, if such be needed. Lionel, it seems. Is it Lionel Dampier? Anyway, Lionel, it seems, was on his way to John Fernandino, as he calls that modern Juan Fernandez. In our way thither, he says, about 4 o'clock in the morning, when we were about 150 leagues from the main of America, our ship felt a terrible shock, which put our men in such consternation that they could hardly tell where they were or what to think. But every one began to prepare for death, and indeed the shock was so sudden and violent that we took it for granted the ship had been struck by a rock. But when the amazement was over, we cast lead and sounded, but found no ground. The suddenness of the shock made the guns leap in their carriages, and several of the men were shaken out of their hammocks. Captain Davis, who lay with his head on the gun, was thrown out of his cabin. Lionel then goes on to impute the shock to an earthquake, and seems to substantiate the imputation by stating that a great earthquake somewhere about that time did indeed do great mischief along the Spanish land. But I should not much wonder if, in the darkness of that early hour of the morning, the shock was after all caused by an unseen whale vertically bumping beneath the hull from beneath. I might proceed, with several more examples, one way or another, known to me, of the great power and malice at times by the sperm whale. In more than one instance, he had been known not only to chase the assailing boats back to their ships, but to pursue the ship itself, and long withstand all the lances hurled at him from its decks. The English ship Pequot can tell a story on that head. And as for his strength, let me say that there have been examples where the lines attached to a running sperm whale have, in a calm, been transferred to the ship, and securing there, the whale towing her great hull through the water as a horse walks over the cart. Again, it is very often observed that if the sperm whale, once struck, is allowed time to rally, he then acts not so often with blind rage as with wilful, deliberate decisions of destruction to his pursuers. Nor is it without conveying some eloquent indication of his chapter that, upon being attacked, he will frequently open his mouth and retain in it that dread expansion for several consecutive minutes. But I must be content with only one more and a concluding illustration, a remarkable and a most significant one, by which you will not fail to see that not only is the most marvellous event in this book corroborated by plain facts of the present day, but that these marvels, like all marvels, are more repetitious of the ages, so that for the millionth time we say, Amen with Solomon, verily, there is nothing new under the sun. Not long to go in this chapter. In the 6th Christian century lived Procopius, a Christian magistrate of Constantinople, in the days when Justinian was emperor and Belisarius was general. As many know, he wrote the history of his own times, a work in every way of uncommon value. With the best authorities, he has always been considered a most trustworthy and unexaggerating historian, except in some one or two peculiarities, not at all affecting the matter presently to be mentioned. Now, in this history of his, Procopius mentions that during the term of his prefecture at Constantinople, a great sea monster was captured by the neighbouring Propontis, or sea mamara, of having destroyed vessels at intervals of those waters for a period of more than 50 years. A fact set thus down in... Hello. That's fine. You may sleep if you wish to. This is some 50 years. Where was I? Hang on. You distracted me. Yeah, a fact thus set down in substantial history cannot easily be gainsaid. Nor is there any reason it should be. Of what precise species this sea monster was, it was not mentioned. But as he destroyed ships, as well as for other reasons, he must have been a whale, for I am strongly inclined to think a sperm whale, and I'll tell you why. For a long time I fancied that the sperm whale had been always unknown in the Mediterranean and the deep waters connecting with it. Even now I am certain that those seas are not, and perhaps never can be in the present constitution of things, a place for his habitual gregarious resort. But further investigations have recently proved to me that in modern times there have been isolated instances of the presence of the sperm whale in the Mediterranean. I am told on good authority that on the Barbary coast, a Commodore Davis of the British Navy found the skeleton of a sperm whale. Now, as a vessel of war readily passes through the Dardanelles, hence a sperm whale could, by the same route, pass out of the Mediterranean into the Propontis. Into the Propontis, as far as I can learn, none of the peculiar substance called brit is to be found, the aliment of the right whale. But I have every reason to believe that the food of the sperm whale, squid or cuttlefish, lurks at the bottom of that sea, because large creatures, but by no means the largest of that sort, have been found at its surface. If, then, you properly put these statements together and reason upon them a bit, you will clearly perceive that, according to all human reasoning, Procopius' sea monster, for that half a century, stove the ships of a Roman emperor, must, in all probability, have been a sperm whale. End of chapter. I'm guessing that the sea there connected to the Mediterranean must be the Black Sea, I guess, unless. So we're really building up to meeting Moby Dick now. These last 3 or 4 chapters have been kind of taking us away from the action and into foreshadowing what's about to happen. Making sure that in this last chapter that we believe what we're about to read. It's really building up the tension here. Melville is saying, what I'm going to write now is amazing. He's saying, this will blow your mind. He's saying, you've got to believe me, and here's why. This, and this. I'm telling you, this is real, this is true. What you are about to read would be incredulous. You'd be incredulous, except for here's the evidence for why it's true. And previously, there was the Whiteness of the whale, that chapter, saying, we've read throughout history all these allusions to whiteness. We've, even as far back as Justinian, never read this, but only know that. Well, me too. I haven't read it before, so I'm really enjoying it. It's really well written. Some of the language in here is just beautiful. Yeah, I think it's excellent. I'm really enjoying it. So we're only like a third of the way through, approaching half of it. How many chapters is there? Chapter 135. So we're on 46. It's about a third, isn't it? It's really good. So you can listen to the previous chapters on my YouTube channel. That's in my my Linktree link in my bio, so you can get onto my YouTube and listen to the previous chapters. And I've also read a few other books like Treasure Island and Frankenstein and Pride and Prejudice, so you can find some of them there as well. And I think I finished my coffee, so I best go and settle up. So I'm in here every Thursday afternoon. Love Shall, yeah. I thought it was very, very good as well. Also a book I haven't read before. So sometimes I've read a book that I have read before in here, on either Haps or on Periscope and YouTube. But most of them I haven't read before, and I'm really enjoying them. Yeah, especially Moby Dick. Anyway, I'll see you all next week. Or whatever I do before then, of course. Right, thanks for watching. Thanks for your awards.